now, one of the most important prominent trends that's already here, and it's present everywhere in our life, is climate change. The main role of the global food chain within the development of our planet apparent. Baarsma, CEO of Rabo Carbon Bank, will provide us with a glance to the developing world of carbon banking and farming. As part of the growing industry, which in its center lies realization that carbon is an important key to the door of our future lives. Without further ado, I'm happy to present Ms. Baarsma.
Hi, my name is Baarsma. I'm the CEO of Rabo Carbon Bank and also Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Amsterdam. And I hope you're enjoying the AgriFest conference. In my talk, I would like to ask you a question to start with. What are you doing from your role, from your position, from your organization to put an internal price on carbon? I would like to take this opportunity to inspire you with a story on what we do with the Rabo Carbon Bank. Because it is an example, a concrete example of how we put a price on something that is valuable to all of us, but doesn't have a price in the market. And that is make agriculture more sustainable. The Rabo Carbon Bank is actually focused on voluntary, nature-based carbon solutions that exist next to the compliance market, the regulated market, like I said before, for instance, the European emission trading system. That already exists for quite a long time. And I'm very happy to say that even a country like China has also set up an emission trading system. At least it announced to do that. So that's very hopeful. But this voluntary carbon market is also a very promising and potentially very important institutions that can help us to combat climate change and to make agriculture more sustainable. It exists in the context of two world problems. And let me talk firstly about these two world problems. And you're familiar with that. You're also familiar with this. This is our world. And in recent decades, it has experienced unprecedented economic growth driven by entrepreneurships, innovation, globalization. But we know that unchecked growth has a downside. Natural resources, soil and water are depleted, and carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are on the rise. And the climate crisis is one of the most urgent problems of our times. It's not only that we need to combat climate change, but we need to counter it. We need to reduce it for the sake of generations to come. We have no time to lose. And you already know that greenhouse gas emissions cause the planet to heat up. But let me tell you something about the carbon balance. Per year, we emit over 51 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents into the atmosphere. And did you know that about a quarter of what we emit globally comes from the food and agriculture? And did you know that once in the atmosphere, almost 60% remains in the atmosphere and only 40% is absorbed back by the natural carbon sinks in the earth? What are those natural carbon sinks? Oceans, trees and soils. And what we try to do at Rabo Carbon Bank, and what I hope you, from your role, from your organization, can also make a contribution to, is work both sides of this carbon balance. So reduce the emissions and help to remove more carbon from the atmosphere in our natural carbon sinks. That's actually what we're doing. And you see that here, because in order to maintain within this limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to change our way of living. We need to change the way in which we produce food, for instance. And And the beautiful thing with agriculture is that, yes, on the one hand, it emits an enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but on the other hand, it has the capacity to take out some of those greenhouse emissions from the atmosphere again and put it in the soils. We'll talk about that later in more details. And the question here is, so how can we keep this blanket of greenhouse gases from heating up the planet more and more? Well, here you see what we're actually doing. What we try to do is firstly, and that has the priority above all, is to prevent greenhouse gas emissions, reduce it, avoid it. And if that's not possible, but only if that is not possible, remove more carbon dioxide equivalents from the atmosphere. Are we doing enough? Are we doing enough to reduce, prevent, and reduce and remove greenhouse gas emissions to keep the planet within this 1.5 degrees Celsius? No, we're not on track. We're not doing enough. Here you see that all of these different graphs actually tell you that we're not doing enough. Even with a very optimistic net zero targets, we don't get below the 2 degrees Celsius limit. We have therefore to really drastically reduce and remove carbon dioxide emissions. We have to change our food system. It is a very difficult task to fundamentally change the food system, given the fact that in 2050, there will be almost 10 billion people on this earth. And on average, they will be a little bit richer than they are right now. So they will buy more food, at least more carbon intensive food. So on the one hand, we need to double production, but on the other, we need to halve the greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Twice the food, half the emissions. So we need to be 4 times as ecologically efficient. That is a huge task. How are we going to do that? And I think that one of the solutions is to transfer from conventional farming to regenerative farming. We as a bank also need to make the transition to regenerative farming. And that's why we have set up the Rabo Carbon Bank. What are we doing? We have actually 3 propositions that we are currently developing together with many stakeholders and partners. And the first is carbon farming. The second is decarbonization of supply chain. And the third is reduction for consumers. I will tell you more about those initiatives. And first is carbon farming. There are many farmers that want to make the transition to regenerative farming. But what we hear from them, our clients, they're in our books, is that they have trouble making that shift. And so what we do is we have set up this one-stop shop where we start by providing agronomic advice on regenerative farming. And that is very important because the potential of regenerative farming as a means to remove and reduce, but especially now remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere into the soils is huge. You see that here on this slide. The potential is 2,400 billions of ton of carbon dioxide stored extra in the soils. And that brings back balance in the carbon balance we were discussing before. Less emissions, but also more removal. So on the removal side, soil sequestration, which is only possible after you transition from conventional to regenerative farming, is extremely important. So what is this regenerative farming? Well, here you see some examples of those beneficial practices that farmers can implement to, on the one hand, reduce, and on the other hand, remove carbon. You may be familiar with that, but reduced tillage, using cover crops, crop rotation, managed grazing, and there's a longer list, but I just give you a few examples. And if you want to reduce, although reduced tillage will also help you to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, if you want to have a massive reduction program, methane digesters for dairy farms may very well help you with that. Reduced synthetic fertilizers or improved animal feed and so on will also have an impact. And then no matter which of these methods are employed, it will take a few years for the soil to improve, to become more healthy, to become so healthy to the extent that it will indeed be able to absorb more carbon from the atmosphere in the soils. So how can we make it attractive for farmers to adopt these practices? Well, in order to make it attractive for them is we set up this one-stop shop where we not just empower them with knowledge and finance and so on, but we also unburden them. We help them by taking away all the administration, all the paperwork, all the data that has to be analyzed and so on. So we really try to enable them to do this. What we do is this one-stop shop for carbon farming. We facilitate the generation and the monitoring and the certification of the carbon credits. Once the greenhouse gases are stored in the soil, you can certify it, and then it becomes a credit that can be sold. And these very high quality carbon credits, we can help them to sell it to large corporates. Clients of us whom we know are very active in sustainability, who are very active with their own reduction strategies. So how does it work? Well, actually, just like a bank, we will act as an intermediary. So in very much the same way as we transfer sums of money from economic agents to with surpluses, and we transfer that to economic agents that would like to utilize those funds, we will be matching the supply of carbon dioxide reduction projects with the demand for carbon footprint compensations. And here are a few steps that we take. First is when the farmer adopts those beneficial regenerative farming practices, the results in removal and reduction in carbon dioxide equivalents. You see that here. And then the stored carbon, we'll measure it so that we have proof that a certain amount of carbon is indeed removed and stored in the soil. And corporates are then able to buy via the carbon bank those certified carbon credits to offset their own non-avoidable emissions. And this generates an extra stream of revenues for the farmers. And in that way, carbon farming is very, very powerful because it results in what I would say at least a triple dividend. Because it generates this extra revenue for farmers that they need to make the transition from conventional farming to more sustainable farming, to regenerative farming. But next to that extra revenue, they also reduce their own emissions and help to reduce that 25% of all global emissions coming from food and agriculture. So it helps to counter climate change. And it also, a healthier soil is not just able to absorb more carbon, but it's also more productive and has higher nutritional value in the crops. So that's very, very important. But another fourth element is what really sets these credits apart, and that's that it also has co-benefits that are very, very difficult to monetize. That's more biodiversity, better water management, more resilience against extreme weather conditions. So these co-benefits are actually the fourth dividend, I would say, and that's why the carbon credits that are soil sequestered are a little bit more expensive than other credits, lower quality credits. But hey, what we've experienced is that large corporate are waiting in line to buy these high quality credits, and they're willing to pay the extra amount for these high quality co-benefit credits. We're sold out already. So I think that when you think about pricing with your stakeholders and clients, please be aware that corporates are willing to pay for extra quality, for those things that are difficult to monetize, that you can monetize via these kinds of credits. We have also, because this is aimed, it's a very high-tech, data-intensive proposition, and we work there mainly with large farmers. We have really large, a large amount of hectares, of acres available. But there are also many, many smallholders in the world who are just as important, or maybe even more important, because we have so many for the food production. For them to start now with this very data intensive and high technology driven proposition is perhaps too much to ask. So what we've developed there, together with Solidaridad and many others, so it's really an effort by many people, is agroforestry projects in, for instance, Africa. And also there, we want to make sure that there's this one-stop shop where the farmer has nothing to worry about. He can plant or she can plant the trees. We'll take care with our partners of all the paperwork, all the generation of certified credits, and then he or she can sell them and have the extra revenue needed to become more self-reliant. So that's really, really important. So that was only the first proposition, but an important one. The second is the decarbonization of supply chain. What we hear from corporates is that they want to achieve their net zero emission targets, but they're having trouble to influence their entire supply chain. And you're probably aware that once you have pledged to the world publicly that you have this net zero ambition in, let's say, 2030 or something, then most of these corporates can very well reduce their own emission, scope 1. And they can talk to their energy suppliers or their heat suppliers, and they can reduce scope 2. But then they look up in their value chain, and actually most of the emission is on the farm level. More than 85%, you see that here on this slide, is on the farm level. So they need the farmers to live up to this pledge of net zero emission in the near future. And that's where we try to help the large corporate to set up reduction projects in the supply chain and set up incentive schemes, financial incentive schemes for the farmer and other supply chain partners to work together in the supply chain to make sure that that reduction is actually achieved. What are the supply chain incentive schemes? The first is what we already talked about. Changing from conventional farming to regenerative farming can help to have removal credits. That's an incentive. It's also that there are reduction projects like what I showed before on the slide, a methane digester or another irrigation system or whatever that helps to reduce. And next to removal credits, we have a system, we're setting it up currently, is of reduction units. So then you have two financial incentives for the partners in the supply chain, especially the farmers, to work together to reduce scope 3 emissions. And that is vital if you want to live up to that net zero emission pledge. What we'll also do is we'll work together. You see that here. So the food corporate, they give us a call, and together with sometimes farmers cooperatives, we picture all of the farmers in the supply chain. We bring them together, and Rabobank, as well as the food corporate and the cooperatives, can give guarantees next to the other two financial incentives I was already talking about. And then perhaps if capital is necessary to invest in those reduction projects, that is done. But we also make sure that, again, the farmers and all of the other partners in the supply chain are unburdened. We take away all the trouble like monitoring, paperwork, and so on, protocoling, verification, and so on. And we make sure that in the end, the reduction is actually achieved, that the food corporate can claim the reduction units for its net zero emission target, and that the farmer is paid. So what we do here in the second proposition is we pre-finance to help farmers in the transition and set up reduction projects. We make sure that there are verified carbon reduction with lower cost and risk, and we have higher security of supply for the farmers, and less carbon intensive production for consumers. And that's actually our third proposition, where we work in the Netherlands. We're also an all finance bank, so we also have a retail, not just food and agri, but also a retail branch. And there what we are setting up currently is insight for our customers in their carbon footprint, and also giving them options of how to compensate those emissions that they cannot avoid, and also some, perhaps you could say, education or tips to prevent carbon emissions. So we're still working on that, and here you see actually what we're doing. So yes, in a nutshell, this is what we're doing, and we have this big dream. So it's allowed to dream, but what we would like to do is in 2030 is to make sure that together with the farmers and the corporates, we have removed and reduced 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, with 50,000 large-scale farmers and millions of smallholders. And actually, this is where I come back to my question in the beginning, because I was talking about credits, I'm talking about reduction units and so on. For me, that's just a means. It's a means for the goal of combating climate change by making agriculture more sustainable. And I was talking to you about internal pricing. And in the end, yes, what we do is we give a price to fighting climate change. In order to have, what we do is we give farmers, together with many partners, we give farmers an extra revenue to make the transition, to be less carbon intensive. But in our own earning model, what we will do, we only do it, we are currently doing it, but we need to do it on a larger scale, is to come to our own internal pricing system. And within a bank, that's credit risk, the risk of the probability of default. And what we have figured out, I'm also a professor of economics, so I like data, I do quite a lot of research. What we have figured out with many others, so it was not just my work, but the work of many others, we did research on the relation between sustainability of our clients and the probability of default, the credit risk. And what we came up with is the following. The more sustainable our clients in the agricultural sector, the lower the credit risk. So this is at the heart of our pricing instrument. What we can do for these very sustainable clients is to give them better tariffs, for instance. And we're now figuring out what kind of tariffs fit with certain levels of sustainability. And that's where I'd like to end this talk, because actually my question is, where is your internal pricing? Just as for a bank, it's credit risk pricing. Where is your pricing mechanism? What can you do differently to price what is important to all of us and what helps us to combat climate change? What is your dream? What would you like to have attained in 2030?
Thank you, Barbara. That was great. So this is it. The moment has arrived to begin the competition for the best Israeli ag tech startup for 2021. So what's going to happen here? We have 8 finalists which are going to present throughout the summit. Each company will pitch, and you will be able to rate each company and give them a score in an online poll below. At the same time, the judges in the competition will ask the company some questions, and we will rate them, and they will rate them as they see fit. At the end of the day, we will announce the winning company based on everybody's score.